All right, so actually, before we get started, we're going to continue the series we've been in for a few weeks. But before we get started, I do want to just sort of acknowledge up front, I have, for the past 10 or 11 days or so, I have been trying really hard to get over a sickness. And I just like a couple of days ago, I just started feeling kind of a little bit back to normal again. And the reason I'm acknowledging that is because, like, if I start to seem like I don't remember what I'm talking about, or I've sort of like lost the plot in some sort of way, it's because, I'm still having some brain fog. I was on a work trip in New Orleans, not for the well. I don't work here, but I work somewhere else, but I do this as well. But I was on a work trip for my other job, and I was in New Orleans, which the two things I love the most when I travel are to like see like museums and eat really good food. And so I got incredibly sick my second day in New Orleans. And so while everybody outside is listening to great music and having good food, I'm in a dark hotel room with bottled water and Ritz crackers, wishing for a swift death. So I did not get the most out of that trip. And so it was just like 2 or 3 days ago that I started feeling normal. And I'm telling this isn't like there's not some sort of big thing that I'm gonna like that's gonna happen at the end of the sermon. It's like, oh, that's why he told us about being sick at the beginning. No. I'm just letting you know, like, if I don't seem right, that's why. So not for the normal reasons I usually don't seem right. So anyway, thank you guys again for being here. Really glad you were able to make it today. So we're doing this kind of weird kind of overlap thing where we are finishing the series that we've been in about sort of the guiding principles of the church, but also we're entering a new conversation that we're going to continue on for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so this is it is the end of one series and also the beginning of like another kind of sub-series, because we're going to talk about the larger concept of justice. And so we've been talking about like these guiding principles, these sorts of things. If you began to ask questions about, and really if you are new to the well, this is a good kind of place to begin, because what we've been kind of doing is asking, like, okay, if we peel back all the layers, all like the stylistic stuff, all the conversational pieces, if we just ask the question, okay, what if the well is nothing but these things, what do we want to be? And that's what we've been attempting to answer with this series. And the last of those pieces is basically we're looking at the value, the virtue of seeking justice. And this can be, depending on what kind of tradition you grew up in, it can be a little bit confusing, it can be a little bit loaded, it can be new for some of us, and we'll talk about that in a second. But again, we're going to start here by talking about this as one of our guiding principles as a church, but also for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about it as, we're going to kind of break it open and look under the hood a little bit more as we kind of look through, the elders have put together a kind of a vision statement for like how we want to engage the note, because justice is a big word. There's a big umbrella over this word that can mean all kinds of different things. And so what we're going to do after this week, for the next few after this, is we're going to kind of break open the statement that the elders created, and we're going to look at like, why are these the words that we chose to put in this, if that makes any sort of sense. And hopefully, if it doesn't make sense now, hopefully in 2 or 3 weeks it will have made sense. So anyway, so we're gonna talk about justice today as kind of a guiding virtue as a church. So we're gonna start off by looking at the book of Micah. So there's this ancient Hebrew prophet named Micah, and a lot of the ancient Hebrew prophets, one of the things that we find is you have this ancient society of people who are trying to figure out, what does it look like for us to be the people that we were always created to be. And quite often what you'll find is people at some point stop being that thing, and then the prophets are the people who come in, because a lot of times I think we look at the prophets and we think like, oh, these are the people who talk about like they can see the future. That was actually never meant to be the primary function of a prophet. The purpose of a prophet was to step into any given situation and speak hard truths to powerful people. And so a prophet is basically the person who says, listen, I realize what I'm about to say might come with some consequences, but it does need to be said. And so often the prophets were the people who first raised their hands and said, hey, I think we're losing our grip on who it is we were created to be in this world. And so Micah is stepping into that kind of conversation. And Micah here in Micah chapter 6, he's doing a bit of what we might today refer to as deconstruction. So Micah is asking lots and lots of questions about, okay, again, not unlike what we're doing with this series, if you peel back the layers of all of this stuff and you begin asking, like, who are we and what are we actually trying to do and be in this world? what does that look like? If all of the cosmetic stuff goes away, who are we actually attempting to be? And so he's asking questions about the practices, the systems, the traditions that we all at this time participate in, and he's interrogating the purposes and the values of those practices. Basically, like, are the things that we do helping us get to becoming the people that we're trying to be? So in Micah chapter 6, he really kind of digs into that. And so in verse 6 of chapter 6, he writes this. He says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? So he's interrogating the practices. He's saying these are the things that we do, right? And everybody just agrees that these are acceptable, good practices to do. So if I come with certain types of sacrifices, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? So he's being a little bit hyperbolic here. He's making kind of a big, broad statement. So shall I offer my firstborn for my transgressions, which is not something that was endorsed, by the way. It's worth saying. The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. So he's taking this to the furthest extreme. And he's saying, like, what if we were overly sacrificial? What if we sacrificed beyond what is reasonable? Is that what is most acceptable to this God? And he's asking a rhetorical question. He answers his own question. And he says, and what does the Lord require? O mortal, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you? And here's the answer to his own question is to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So there are these three attributes that this prophet says, okay, here are some indicators. Here are some signposts that serve as a strong reminder of who you are and your intended role in the world. And if we deviate from these things, then it really doesn't matter how loud our songs are. And it doesn't really matter like how much we give to this particular institution. None of that stuff has any kind of meaning if it is absent justice and mercy and humility. And so the first of these three attributes is those who do justly. And in other words, people who are seekers of justice, people who are invested in the notion of what justice is. And again, we talked about a second ago, justice is a big, broad word, and there are lots of things that we could sort of like tack onto that and say, well, that's what justice is. And so the next question becomes, okay, well, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Bible as a whole, when the word justice is discussed, what are we talking about when we talk about justice? And before we get into that though, I want to just acknowledge for a long time, and this is not something I was raised with. I'll just fully acknowledge. I grew up in an evangelical Baptist church in a small town in Oklahoma. The concept of justice was not part of the theological discussion. It wasn't anti-justice. It just wasn't, it never came up. And so for a long time, my basic understanding of faith was very deeply individualistic. Like you would have lots of conversations about like, how is your faith walk, right? Like, I don't know if you grew up in this type of tradition. And so it was all about the individual. And again, I grew up in every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday, like I was a Baptist kid, so like born and bred Falls Creek. Like I don't know how many Falls Creek kids we have here, but like, yeah, we got one. So I don't know how we can be in a church in Oklahoma and not have more Falls Creek alumni. That seems strange. But there's, anyway, but I spent a lot of time. I was not a passive, sometimes churchgoer. I lived in that building and almost never heard anybody talk about justice as it is discussed in the Bible. It was always like any kind of discussion about faith was always from the individual point of view. It was always individualized. So the concept of justice or using any amount of energy to benefit marginalized people groups was completely absent. And in fact, I was in college as a religion major when I first heard my first sermon about justice, and it blew my mind. It never occurred to me that this was actually supposed to be a part of the whole thing all along. And any discussion about marginalized people groups or any sort of suffering that people were going through, it always revolved around not we need to find a way to ease the suffering of other people. It was always we need to make sure these people have Bibles and t-shirts with Bible verses on them. And we need to make sure that there are white missionaries over there, like teaching them how to act more like white American Christians. Truthfully, that was sort of my perception of like, this is how you're supposed to engage with the suffering of others. Not things like food and clothing and other basic needs. It was always like, well, do they have Bibles? Have they heard the message of Jesus? And which is not an unimportant conversation, but it also doesn't speak to the notion of like, are we actually seeking justice, or are we just trying to make sure these people have the same team uniform that we have? And so I remember when I was my first year as a youth minister, I was a youth minister in Fort Worth. That was my first ministry job. And I remember the church that I was with joined up with this larger kind of massive missions movement. And we all spent 2 weeks in Houston, my very first summer as a youth pastor. And for that 2 weeks, we did lots of what's often referred to as inner city missions. And so we were down in one of the more impoverished neighborhoods in Houston, and they were looking for, and there was like this big tent, and they had like this like kind of a buffet line of different soups and chilies that they were going to serve people in the neighborhood. And so they'd like gone around, and they sent a bunch of the youth group kids out in groups with adults to like bring people back to come and have some food. And then while the kids were out trying to find more people, the person who organized it said, we need one of the youth ministers to preach a sermon. And somebody volunteered me for this, and I had like 30 minutes to get ready. Because that's how youth ministry stuff works sometimes. And I remember like saying like, okay, well, like, what do you want me to talk about? Like, I've at this moment in my life, I've maybe preached like 3 sermons. So like this is pretty new. I'm gonna have to really like come up with something here. And they were like, well, it needs to be like 15 to 20 minutes long. It needs to be a gospel-centric message. And so I said, okay, I'll come up with something. And so they had everybody gathered, and they had all the food, and the food smelled really good, and they told everybody as they got there, like, we won't be serving food until after the sermon is over, and you can't eat anything unless you sit through the sermon. This was not something that was communicated to me before I was asked to preach the sermon, and so I preached a fast sermon. So, but the thing is, like, it felt like such a mean bait and switch. Does that not seem cruel? You know what I mean? Like, we're talking about people who are probably, this may be the only meal they've had in a day or two. And you're telling them like, yeah, you can eat, but you have to eat on our terms. And you have to accept, and maybe you can get to the front of the line if you like agree to say a prayer after or something like that. You know, I mean, it seems very, very mean-spirited, but it's truthfully, that's how it felt to me. And it really never sat right to me that we did it that way and that I participated in it the way that I did. And so the whole thing was like the food was almost kind of like a trick, you know, to get people to come and hear this thing that would hopefully like make them agree to some sort of gospel-centric message, which again, in and of itself, not necessarily a bad thing, but just that we're not that interested in whether or not hungry people have food. We are interested in, are we communicating this message that we want to communicate, and can we use the food as kind of like a weapon a little bit to make them listen to it? And so this was a reflection of this larger systemic notion that individualized belief and dogma are somehow more important than issues of justice and empathy and concern for others. And so, and again, like because I had never heard a sermon about justice or equity or these kinds of things, like this kind of thing, I did not have the language to kind of explain, like, why does this feel gross to me that we're doing it in quite this way? But the thing is, like, again, I heard this one sermon when I was in college, and then throughout, like after that, began to really kind of explore. And there were lots of other writers that kind of emerged at around that same time. I don't know if you're familiar with like Shane Claiborne, or his writing really affected me a lot around that period of time. And there were a couple of others that were really instrumental in kind of helping me kind of see a fuller picture of what it is that we're doing here and why this individualized thing is just too small, quite frankly. And if justice is absent from this conversation, then we are not doing the thing that Micah is calling us to do, which is to seek justice and to love mercy and to be humble. And the thing is, you cannot take Scripture seriously without some awareness of our call towards being seekers of justice. I feel like there was so much left unsaid in my upbringing in church because this just never came up. So look at Isaiah chapter 1. There's another Hebrew prophet. In Isaiah 1, verse 16, this writer says this. And again, he's writing this is a prophet. He's speaking truth to power. He's talking about like, here may be some things that we're missing that maybe we need to grab a hold of. And in verse 16, he says, wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. All over the Hebrew scriptures, there is language about taking up the cause of the fatherless and the widow and the foreigner. It happens so, like, in fact, it's been a little while, but like we preached a whole sermon just about like all the different times you see this phrasing show up throughout the Hebrew scriptures. It is so repetitive that these Hebrew writers continue to say, like, no matter what you do, let's not forget that our job here is to take up the cause of the widow and the fatherless and the foreigner. And if we don't do that, then who exactly do we think we are? So all over the scriptures, it is everywhere. Then if you jump over into what we refer to as the New Testament, into the teachings of, actually this is before the teachings of Jesus. Before Jesus even shows up in the book of Luke, you have this guy named John, who's referred to as John the Baptist. Or John the Baptizer. And so in Luke chapter 3, John has some very specific words for people who have taken personal, like the personalized, individualized faith and excluded the justice part of the conversation. And so John has some words for these guys. In Luke chapter 3, verse 7, he says this. It says, John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers," which, by the way, if you have people who are gathering like in mass to hear you talk, and you're like, this is really gonna grow this, like they're like, okay, there are conferences that you can go to if you're a pastor, which I'm not, but if you were a pastor, you could go to these conferences, and they have all kinds of like workshops and seminars about here's how you make your church bigger, here's how you grow the crowd. Like once you see momentum, you gotta do everything you can to make sure the crowds don't shrink. You gotta, they refer to it as making it stickier, closing the back door, or whatever language they like to use. And so none of it has to do with like, once the crowd gets pretty big, look out and say like, you brood of vipers. Like that is not part of the curriculum. So John, as the crowd begins to grow, John says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children from Abraham." And he's making reference to some ancient Hebrew tradition here. And then in verse 9, it says, "The axe is already at the root of the tree, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. What should we do then?" The crowd. So in other words, the crowd is like, whoa, like this is escalated very quickly. What exactly do you recommend that we do, John the Baptizer? And so John answered, "Anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none. And anyone who has food should do the same." John does not say, like, you haven't even prayed the correct prayer yet. He doesn't say, like, how many Bibles have you handed out to small children in other countries? He doesn't say any of that. He says, anyone who has 2 shirts should give one to somebody who doesn't have any. Anyone who has food should do the same. Whenever there's a call to any kind of authentic spirituality in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, there is a direct appeal to care for the needs of other people who are suffering. In Matthew chapter 25, and we've looked at this already once, we're going to look at it again in a couple of weeks. This is a deeply important part of this conversation. So this is Jesus speaking. And in Matthew 25, verse 31, it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing to clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" So again, according to Jesus, when we serve those who suffer, we are directly encountering the divine. There is a divine presence in those moments in which we practically and directly address the suffering of somebody else. Notice, Jesus does not say, "I needed clothes and you gave me a Bible. I needed food and you said, oh, thoughts and prayers." No, Jesus says, like, yeah, I had specific, deeply human needs, and you met my needs, or you sought to address my needs. You saw me as a human being, and you treated me that way. That's what's being said here. There's another, we're going to spend a little bit more time in Matthew. So if you go back a couple of chapters, in Matthew chapter 23, there's a passage, and I realize we're going kind of fast, but that's what I do. So in Matthew 23, there's this passage, and Jesus, this is part of what's often referred to as the seven woes. And the seven woes is basically, it's kind of like the bizarro, the Sermon on the Mount. It's basically like, here's all the stuff that you're doing wrong, but it's only directed towards religious leaders, so we're all totally on board with it. And so Jesus goes to these religious leaders, and he lists off these seven woes. Basically, like, here are all the ways that you're actually making the world worse. And so in Matthew 23, verse 23, he enters into one of those seven woes. And in verse 23, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees." In other words, religious leaders, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. Okay, we need a time out here for just 1 second. What is Jesus talking? So he says, "Woe to you, you tithe off of your spices." So if all you have is that, what is he even talking about? So there is, in Deuteronomy chapter 14, I don't have to tell you this, you have this memorized, but in Deuteronomy 14, there's a passage in Deuteronomy. It's part of this larger body called like the law, the Torah, the law text. And so these are the things that everyone is expected to do according to this ancient law. And so Deuteronomy 14 verse 22, it says this. It says, "Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling in his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always." So in other words, what's going on here is if you have crops, if you are, because this is a very agrarian society, and so if you are growing something, if you are raising something, then 1/10 of that thing is supposed to be taken and either given directly to the leaders of the synagogue, or they are meant to be taken and eaten in a specific way as if to remind you that this whole thing is a gift. God is teaching people life is a gift. Everything that you have because it has been given to you. The religious leaders, and so it's contextualized in terms of like if you have grain, or if you have like livestock or something like that. And so the religious leaders at this time, the time that Jesus is teaching, are so passionate and they are so literal that they even applied it to their spices, which if you really think about it, like imagine like going to Crest and buying like a thing of spice and then pouring it out and then dividing up a tenth of it, and then like that's the tenth. Like that's how seriously they took this, even though it doesn't specifically say anything about spices, notice, in Deuteronomy. So they've taken what's being said in Deuteronomy and they're like, we have to take this to the furthest extreme that we can find, because how will we know that we're not messing up unless we take it to the furthest extreme? And part of it also is because in Jesus' day, and we talked about this before, the Roman Empire had conquered the Judean territory. And so there were people, specifically the people that Jesus is speaking to, who believed that the Roman occupation is punishment from God for not more directly obeying all of the commandments. And so the religious leaders thought, we have to go to the furthest possible extreme in order to not accidentally break one of the commandments. So there's this, and there was a term for it. They called it building a hedge around Torah. And the idea is like, so here are the commandments. So we'll build a hedge on the outer rim of that, and then we'll do all the things around the hedge, basically, metaphorically speaking, so that we won't even get close to accidentally violating one of these commands. And the mint, dill, and cumin, the spices, that's part of the hedge. It's like, yeah, it's not necessarily named in the Torah, but just to be safe, we better do it anyway. So what's being taught here is all of life is a gift, and you should divide up what you have as a way to remind you that what you have is a gift and is a way of expressing gratitude. So Jesus says, woe to you, you do this. In other words, you are so dogmatic that even like you are so careful about how many grains of cumin you are consuming in the correct way. And then, so now let's go back and look at the rest of it. So in verse 23, he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you have neglected, and watch his language here, you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So justice, and again, the question that we asked at the very beginning is, when we talk about justice, what exactly are we talking about? This is a giant idea in the ancient world. It is the answer to the question. Basically, if you want to know, like, what was the first century answer to the question, what are we talking about when we talk about justice? It is the answer to the question, what, as a human being, if I'm just talking about myself, as a human being, what do I believe I am entitled to? Just for the fact that I exist on this planet, what am I entitled to? And what happens when someone else is being deprived of those things? What are the very basic things that I as a person living in this world should have? And if somebody else does not have those things, what should my response to that be? That is, if you just like peel back all the layers of it, that is the core of the question. What are we talking about when we talk about justice? So Jesus says, you have failed to show the world what God is like. You have failed to be an advocate for justice and mercy. You are more concerned with how your spices are divided up than you are with, is my neighbor starving to death? And so let's look at the whole, we've been kind of breaking it up. So let's look at the whole verse. So in verse 23, just the whole thing now. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So it's not, in other words, it's not that the individual stuff doesn't matter. Jesus isn't saying like you're wasting your time if you want to like express gratitude for the things that you have. He's not saying that. He's not saying like these practices that you do, I'm not mad that you're doing those things. It's that there are some things that are, in Jesus's words, not mine, are more important. And Jesus is saying, if you don't do the more important things, it really doesn't matter that much how carefully you divide your spices. So then in verse 24, he says, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. And so in Aramaic, this is an interesting turn of phrase because in Aramaic, these words actually rhyme. In Aramaic, the word gnat is the word kamla with a Q-A-M-L-A. And the word camel is the word gamla. So it's the same word, but with a G at the beginning. So in Aramaic, he's saying, you strain out a kamla and you swallow a gamla. So he's being, it's like, I don't know, like a first century like rap battle or something. I don't know, like it's, Lin-Manuel Miranda is this close to writing a musical about this. I can feel it. So the people that Jesus is talking to here are the religious leaders of their day, and they were so zealous that when they ate, they would be terrified that they would get a bug or a gnat in their drink. And so there was this complicated system of strainers that you'd put on the top, which, I mean, you're in the desert, and so like this is not an unreasonable thing to be afraid of. And so there was this complicated system of strainers at the top of all the drinks that you would put on. So you'd have to like undo all the strainers, take a drink of your beverage, and then put the strainers back together and put it back on, because if a gnat gets in your drink, then you've got a gnat in your drink. And so, but also it's not just because like it's gross, which it is, but it's also out of religious significance. There's actually a religious reason for this. So in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 20, again, part of like this larger law system, in Leviticus 11 verse 20, it says this. So this is part of a larger text that's just basically defining like if you eat certain things, you are ceremonially considered unclean. So in Leviticus 11 verse 20, it says all flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean by you. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat, which is, imagine taking notes when you're reading this. Those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground, of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. Phew, that's a relief. So then in verse 23, it says, but all other flying insects that have 4 legs, you are to regard as unclean. So there are certain insects that are considered ceremonially unclean. So if you get a gnat in your drink and you accidentally swallow it, you are unclean. You cannot do all of the things that you would want to do in terms of your religious devotion because you accidentally got a gnat in your drink. But also, if you back up a couple of verses in the same chapter in Leviticus, in verse 4, it says, in Leviticus 11:4, it says, there are some, again, talking about animals that are clean and unclean, there are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. So what does a gnat and a camel have in common? They are both unclean. So if you swallow a gnat, this is to scale, I guess, I don't know. So if you swallow if you strain out a gnat, which they were definitely trying to do, but they swallow a camel, it totally defeats the purpose of straining out the gnat. And so Jesus is, again, he's using this very big language. And it's not only would this have been like sort of a memorable mental picture that Jesus is painting, but gnats and camels have something to do with clean and unclean. And so when Jesus makes this statement, it would have been kind of a hurtful critique, really, to the religious leaders. He's saying, you spent so much time worried about the gnat, you accidentally swallowed the camel. It's not it's not that the individual dimensions of our humanity and spirituality are not important. I think Jesus would say, yeah, those are important. I'm not saying don't do those things. Don't stop worrying about the gnat, but also let's pay a little bit of attention to the camel, shall we? It's that focusing mainly on those things, on like the individualized, like personal types of things, can lead us to miss the larger, in Jesus' words, more important issues of justice and mercy. When people are suffering, Jesus expects his people to do something about it. And he says, when you don't do that, it's like straining out a gnat, but swallowing a camel. If all of your questions have to do with what am I doing, what like my own personal like growth, devotion, church attendance, whatever, and we never ask a follow-up question about like, are there people in our midst who are struggling and who are suffering? And are we doing anything more than just trying to figure out how to convert them to our team? Then are we doing anything other than straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel? When people are suffering, Jesus expects his people to do something about it. And there are people here I know who have a lot more data and information about these kinds of things than I do. But in Oklahoma City, in Edmond, there is a portion of our population who are food insecure. There are people who struggle a lot with where is the next bag of groceries going to come from. If summer's about to start, there are some kids for whom school is the only place they get a reliable daily meal. And so there are questions about are we interested in these questions? Are we curious about are there things that we can do to ease the fear and the anxiety and the pain of a parent who does not know how to feed their kids all summer long? There are so many other types of conversations. We could talk about incarceration. We could talk about domestic violence. We could talk about the struggle of single parents in a world where everything is getting unbearably expensive. And how do we support people? How do we offer something more than thoughts and prayers? And what are we doing about it? And as a church, as a church that is committed to one of our core values being we want to be seekers of justice, what does it look like for us, for the Well, to be a community in which the question of who in our midst is suffering and what can we do about it? In what ways can we make somebody's life just a little bit easier? In what ways can we ease the suffering and the anxiety and the fear of somebody else in our midst? Systemically, there are lots of other, again, you could look around and find all sorts of things. And if you ever like see something or hear something and think to yourself, surely that's not the way it was supposed to be. Maybe this is Jesus saying, like, yeah, and who do you expect to do something about that? We have seen in the last decade or so, we've seen a rise in white supremacist groups, in hate crimes, in attempts to make it more difficult for people in low income or high minority communities to vote. And it is, it's upsetting. And it's not just upsetting because like, oh, that's a shame. It's upsetting because it's not the way it was supposed to be. If this was happening to you, what would you expect somebody else to do about it? What would you hope somebody would do about it? Because again, if you peel back all the layers, what is justice? Justice is what are the things that I as a human being should have? And if somebody else does not have those things, what does it look like for me to try and bridge that gap? So the question becomes, what does it look like for us to engage with what Jesus refers to as the more important matters of justice and mercy? The questions of things like discipleship and generosity and the other virtues that we've talked about in the series, Jesus is not saying like, don't even worry about that. What he's saying is like, yeah, you do one without neglecting the other. But don't forget the more important matters of justice and mercy. Let us never be the kind of community that strains out the gnat and continuously swallows the camel. So may we find our place in a story that is about justice and love and mercy. May we acknowledge and see the struggles and the pain and the suffering of others. And may we do something more than shake our heads and say, oh, that's a shame. Thoughts and prayers. May we acknowledge this deep, widespread longing for things to get better for those who suffer, for those who are marginalized, and for those who are deprived of the things that we believe that we as individuals are entitled to simply because we are alive in this world. We're going to take communion in a second. And communion is this picture. I want to invite the ushers to go ahead and start passing things out. And if you want to take communion with us, go ahead and grab one of those cups. Everyone is welcome to take communion. If you don't want to, that's totally up to you. Don't feel pressured to do so. But if you would like to, you are welcome to. But communion is this reminder of right before Jesus is arrested and executed. Jesus says, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you. He's saying, I have broken myself open and poured myself out for you. And is it not possible that when Jesus does this for us, and he says, do this to remember me, is it not just take these sacraments and do this to remember me, but also break yourselves open and pour yourselves out as a way of reminding the rest of the world what I am actually like? So as we receive communion, may we also remember that part of our role here is to be communion for others, to break ourselves open and to pour ourselves out so that somebody else might have life. May we find the places in our world, in our society, in our zip code, where there are people who are just barely hanging on, and may we break ourselves open, and may we pour ourselves out so that they might have a little bit more hope and a little bit more life, and that they might say, oh, if this is what Jesus is like, I would like to know more.